This is Away Series 2, a podcast for anyone interested in a fresh approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. This is episode 12. Hello. God, I wish they'd bring back that show, The Comeback. Freaking genius. Although right now I'm fully immersed in season 2 of the OA. I love it. Okay, let's get going, especially since we got through like 2.5 pages in the last episode. Picking up at the bottom of page 63 in Ray, the third step. We found it very desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person, such as our wife, our best friend, or spiritual advisor. But it is better to meet God alone than with one who might misunderstand. The wording was, of course, quite optional, so long as we expressed the idea, voicing it without reservation. This was only a beginning, though, if honestly and humbly made, an effect, sometimes a very great one, we felt at once. The first line's important. It doesn't reference a sponsor because the book never does. But assuming you're comfy with your sponsor, then that is a good person to go to. The point is, regardless, that you're admitting you can't do it alone to another person and you're asking him or her for help. All out loud. It's the out loud part, especially if you're not a believer, that's quote unquote humbling. It also, in my experience, makes it a lot harder to relapse or easier to stay sober because now, if you drink again, you've got at least one person you'll have to tell. Or ghost. Neither of those things feels great. The prospect of shame. Well, you know I think shame is an excellent motivator when used responsibly. Okay. Now for the action. Literally. Next, we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom. So we had to get down to causes and conditions. Okay, so here comes the big scary step 4. Spoiler alert, it's not scary. In fact, everything we've been talking about up until now, whether you're a devoted big book adherent or not, has prepped you for this step. And right there, the writers call it house cleaning. Now, I just spent this last weekend spring cleaning. I went deep, and cleaned and turned all the rugs and mattresses, washed all the windows, every blanket, every throw pillow. Let me tell you, it was not easy, and I'm sorer today than I am after my most intense weightlifting days. But the thing about step 4, you can only go as deep as you can go. Unclear? Depending on how far along you are in sobriety, how much clearer you are, how clouded you may still be by other emotional and mental disorders, you may only be able to skim the surface. You may be ready or only capable of cleaning out one junk drawer. And that's okay. No matter what anyone else says, you may only be able to see the messiness of a single drawer, right? The rest of the house may look, for now, really clean, and maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. I think all humans have a few hidden messes. Okay, I've taken this analogy too far. Sip of coffee. The really important part of that last paragraph, I mean, maybe there are two important things. The first is the emphasis on action. You hear people in the room say all the time, action, action, and more action. And that is a quote from the book. It's also kind of just the truth about change. You can't just wish for what you want. You have to work for it. Faith without works is dead. What does faith without works is dead really mean? The phrase in the Bible means that faith alone will not save you. A commitment to God cannot be demonstrated without good deeds. So, like, in not King James biblical language, good intentions, kind thoughts, a desire to be better, it's all lovely, but ultimately meaningless if you don't use those feelings and thoughts to do things. I think I've quoted the Pope on this like a million times now. We pray for the hungry, then we feed them. That's how prayer works. Essentially, you pray for the desire and strength to do the work of feeding the hungry. Or at least that's how I understand it. So it's here on page 64 that we begin the actionable steps, the steps that require more than faith. The steps that, should you want to quote-unquote do them, you will need to actually do some stuff. That said, the most important actionable step is step 12. Steps 4 through 11 are mostly about preparing you to discover and develop your best self, which ultimately makes step 12 more meaningful and useful. Second, but no less important, is that liquor was but a symptom. Now, they're saying that as a lead up to step 4, maybe implying that you drank because of or in response to something or someone. And all along in this podcast, we've been saying the same thing, more or less, keeping in mind that it was written in 1939, and they didn't have access to a lot of information we have access to today. It might be true, as I believe it was for me, that I drank to medicate my otherwise debilitating anxiety. So it wasn't that the liquor was a symptom per se, it was a solution. I don't actually think I drank because of any of my other quote-unquote problems, but of course that may not be true for you. You may very well identify with the idea that you drank to erase certain feelings that were not rooted in a deeper mental or emotional disorder. So let's say you started to drink to numb the pain of abuse. The liquor was a solution to the pain. In time, the liquor became a necessity, but no longer a working solution. So now, either way, we're both alcoholics. It's the alcoholism that is a symptom, in my opinion. The drinking, not the drink itself. With that idea in mind, we can move, hopefully, more easily into step 4. Let's read. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking a commercial inventory is a fact-finding and fact-facing process. It is an effort to discover the truth about the stock in trade. One object is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. If the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure. So, yeah, this seems a bit cold or sharp, but all it's saying, really, is that in order to successfully stop drinking for the long term, we need to look at the things that may make that proposition more difficult. Today, we might call some of them triggers or defenses. The point is really that we need to identify some of the stuff we drink over. So let's change up that last sentence and instead say, first, we searched out the raw or tender spots in our minds and memories which may have played a part in our desire or need to drink. Okay. Believe it or not, there are a few good things in the next paragraph. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have not only been mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. We listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. We asked ourselves why we were angry. In most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, yada, yada, yada. So my experience with this is, of course, as a woman and working with women. But I've heard from plenty of men who don't identify with the language of this either. That is specifically with the idea that resentment and anger are the problem. For a lot of women, I think the offender is often more easy to identify when it's thought of instead as despair, anguish, not anger. Since you're going to hear way too many people use the word resentment way too often in the rooms, it's a good idea to have a working definition of it for yourself. That way, when they say it, you know what it means to you, and you don't have to concern yourself with what it means to anyone else. So, the word resentment in 16th century English was resentiment and meant only the state of being deeply affected by something. And from the French, ressentir means only to feel. Same in Latin, sentir. The way the writers of the Big Book are using it is kind of the way Nietzsche used it in his Genealogy of Morality, which was written in 1887. That is resentiment. He was German, so slightly different pronunciation, is a reassignment of the pain that accompanies a sense of one's own inferiority or failure onto an external scapegoat. The ego creates the illusion of an enemy, a cause that can be blamed for one's own inferiority or failure. Thus, one is thwarted not by a failure in oneself, but rather by an external evil. So Nietzsche's kind of ahead of his time, right? So I think that's what the writers are sort of looking at, and you may very well identify with that. Part of me does too. But how do we really talk about that now? Projection, maybe, low self-esteem, defenses. It isn't really all about anger. Anger is, for most of us, a secondary emotion anyway. A secondary emotion does not mean it is an emotion that precedes another, but rather it is not a primary emotion. Many people resort to anger when faced with more difficult emotions. I mean, basically, anger is easier to feel than fear or sadness. Fear and sadness are considered primary emotions and include everything from anxiety to humiliation. Because anger is usually accompanied by a rush of energy, which automatically makes us feel like a boss, it's kind of easier. And because the triggering event caused a primary emotion like fear to fire, we feel particularly vulnerable. Ugh. And anger alleviates those very uncomfortable feelings. So maybe you're lucky. Although I don't know if that's the word. But maybe you are in luck now, in this moment, because anger was never the emotion that surfaced. Maybe for you, the primary feeling was the feeling that emerged. So whatever that primary feeling that's what you're going to look for in step 4. I can honestly say now that I identify with it, but it came to me in a roundabout way. I was, by all appearances, a very angry teenager, and that label followed me well into my adulthood. But it wasn't anger that I felt. I behaved angrily toward my mother mostly. But my real feelings were always fear. For so many reasons, fear of rejection and abandonment was at the bottom of it all. I was lucky that even before I got sober, I understood that my anger wasn't really anger. It still took me a long time to get over it. And it still comes back. I just don't hold on to it. Anyway, I go again. So whatever your primary yucky emotion is, that's the first one you're going to look for in step 4. Let's read, page 65. And on our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal or sex relations which had been interfered with? We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. All right, let's just remove the word grudge to start, because for many of us, they're not grudges, right? I like to suggest doing step 4 the way my sponsor suggested it to me. Make 3 columns. In the first column, you'll write the name of the person or place that caused you pain, whatever adjective you've chosen to identify that pain. In the second column, you'll write the cause of the pain, grief, anger, whatever. What happened to make you feel this way? And then, why are you writing this person down? The event. And in the third column, you are going to try and identify the primary emotion. The examples in the book are antiquated, although to a degree they stand up. I mean, the idea that the man taking his inventory would resent Mr. Brown for being overly attentive to his wife makes sense. And then he examines the primary emotion beneath the secondary emotion of anger and realizes that maybe the real feeling is fear. That Mr. Brown's attentiveness to his wife makes him feel insecure in his own position as husband. That his wife will like Mr. Brown more than she likes him. This may make him feel like less of a man. But those feelings are verboten. Certainly, until recently, men have been told that feelings like those are not allowed. So how does it come out? Anger. Moving on. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. So again, you may very well identify with this if you're someone who identifies with the anger label. You may be someone who projects, who lays blame at everyone else's feet and never takes responsibility for your own. Or You may be someone who, no matter what, directs all that anger inward, and you only ever blame yourself, even when you're not to blame at all. You may be a little bit of both. I think it's natural to lash out when we feel vulnerable. We are animals. Our fight or flight switch can be turned on, but perhaps none of this fits you at all, or at least you can't see where it fits now, and that's totally fine. But for all of us, the task now is to look at our list and try our very best to remember that our personal paradigm plays a part. That is, our perspective in every situation is informed by our own unique experiences, which makes most of us uniquely unable to see any of this objectively. I'm in no way saying that you are not a victim in certain circumstances, but there will or should be things on your step 4 that you may not be able to see clearly and in which you may have played a role. On to page 66. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal, for when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again, and with us, to drink is to die. Very dramatic, but also kind of right. They're acknowledging that anyone, alcoholic or not, who leads with anger and resentment is probably going to have a pretty shitty life. And then they're saying basically that for us, it's a little scarier than that, right? Because we medicate the emotions with poison. So whether or not you identify the sticky spots as resentments or something else, it's important to at least try to let go. Even if it's anguish, is it helping you to remain mired in it? Whatever the feeling, whether or not it was caused by another person, regardless of whether he or she was wrong, is this emotion serving you at all anymore? Anger, sadness, fear eat away at the fabric of your life. They arrest your growth. It's a big part of why you hear people in the rooms talk about being only as mature as they were when they started drinking heavily, right? Because it was right then and there that they found an elixir for their wound. Is that even right? Elixir for a wound? That they found a salve for their wound? Whatever. And they never moved through it, so their growth was arrested. So whether or not you're in search of a spiritual experience or just the most basic sense of well-being, then letting go of some of the negative thoughts and patterns will be necessary. Bottom of the page. We turned back to the list, for it held the key to the future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry. Thy will be done. So, I don't love this paragraph, although I'm not certain it's obvious why. It's definitely speaking to a particular type of person, a person who is really struggling with perspective, perhaps the very angry person who blames everyone else. The idea there is kind of a trick. For example, our guy is looking over his inventory and he just cannot see clear to forgiving Mr. Brown. But what if he tried to see Mr. Brown differently? What if he thought about Mr. Brown as a man who also had problems? Maybe Mr. Brown struggles with his own feelings of inadequacy. Maybe he flirts with our guy's wife because it makes him feel more masculine. So if our guy can keep that in mind, can he let go of the resentment? It's not the same as befriending Mr. Brown. It's more like, I don't know, when someone pushes you while you're walking down the street. Instead of getting really angry and cursing at them, could you let it go because maybe that person is rushing to the hospital because her father was taken to the ER, or she was just fired and in her own head? Easier said than done, I know, but we just have no idea what's going on in the lives of others. That said, if you need text, just stop and move aside. I mean, come on. Eyes up when you're walking. Or driving. What I dislike a lot about this passage, I guess it's sort of how it's worded, but it's more the way people misuse it. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would show a sick friend. Firstly, none of those words come to mind when I think of caring for a sick friend. I mean, I'm sure they do for some, but I don't need to summon patience or, people are difficult sometimes. I get it. I really hate the word pity. I hate it. And that may be like a me thing, but something about it here strikes me as very arrogant. This is a sick man. How can I help him? And that's the way it's so often misused. People put themselves on a higher plane when they say this. Does that make sense? It's like instead of trying to empathize with the person who supposedly or did wrong you in some way, you degrade them. And you may still be the one in the wrong. Just because someone said or did something you don't like or hurt your ego doesn't mean that person is sick or pitiable. I feel like I'm not being very articulate. The idea they're trying to convey, I hope, is that empathy is the key to letting go. I think, sadly, the way they wrote it sounds a little smug, and there are always people who just love it. He pissed me off, but I have to remember he's sicker than me. Or maybe you're just an ass. So it's like the book so far keeps trying to break us, and now it's like, just kidding, you're still better than most people. Of course it doesn't say that, but that's my perception. Alrighty, moving right along. Bottom of page 67. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, the employer, and the wife. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. It took a while for me to really identify fear in my story. Fear doesn't necessarily look the same in everyone's story. But if you pull back and really examine not only your mistreatment of others, but of yourself, you can probably start to see how many of those decisions, even the ones that seemed bold, were born of fear. My boldness was boldness sometimes, but not always. Sometimes it was just thoughtlessness or carelessness mixed with the great disinhibitor alcohol. So sometimes it was a self-loathing and therefore a total disregard for my life fueled by booze and drugs. But when I or you peel away the layers of bullshit, I at least see a mess of anxiety and fear that made my life unbearable, in which I used alcohol and drugs to medicate. Not only did they medicate, they made me feel invincible. Until, of course, they didn't anymore. Page 68. Perhaps there is a better way. We think so. For we are now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We are in the world to play the role He assigns, just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us and humbly rely on Him. Does He enable us to match calamity with serenity? I love that. Match calamity with serenity, with or without God. Whew. We never apologize to anyone for depending on our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. We ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be. At once, we commence to outgrow fear. Sure, absolutely. If you're a believer, 100%. Keeping, of course, firmly in mind that your religion itself does not belong in the rooms. But the way I understand this, now that I'm sober enough to be able to identify some of the more dangerous and difficult patterns and find the buried good within, I'm actually also able to start trusting some of my own thoughts and feelings again. Alone? No. I run it by a friend or a sponsor. If it's a huge decision by a lot of people, maybe a therapist, I think about it. I get some clarity. I don't react. But at this point in your journey, you're probably able to start relying on yourself again a little bit. Remember, we discussed your worst thinking got you here, your best thinking got, whatever the fuck that is. You do have some good thinking in there. So you will be able to rely on yourself. You're saying, I wasn't a bad person. I was a person who did some bad things. So regardless, faith in God or faith in yourself and others, either way, you'll begin to change. I'm not doing the rest of this chapter at all, ever. This is Bill writing about what he needed, the sex inventory. From my understanding, not all the men who were writing this needed a whole separate inventory for sex. And most of the men I know now don't either. I mean, maybe you feel a need to make a list of every person you've ever had sex with and review how you mistreated them and make a decision not to treat anyone that way again. But it's my opinion that that should just be on your main list. Shitty behavior is shitty behavior. Using people, whatever. On that note, we will wrap it up and we'll get into action in the next episode. As ever, I hope this helped. And remember that no matter what, there is a way.